To begin with, could each of you introduce yourself to our SAF members and share a little bit about your background and expertise?
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. My name's Leigh Greenwood. I'm the Nature Conservancy's Forest Health Program Director. The Nature Conservancy is a big global nonprofit dedicated to the protection of land and water for the benefit of all. And we have both state chapters, which you might be familiar with, as well as national and global offices. I'm part of the North America office, and I'm in charge of thinking about things that affect forest health from the forest pest and pathogen perspective, which is how I became part of this authoring team for the paper we're going to discuss today.
Great, thanks, Leigh. Grant, could you introduce yourself to the SAF members?
Yeah, Chris, nice to be with you guys. Grant Domke, I'm a research scientist. I work in the nation's forest inventory and analysis program within Forest Service R&D, and I lead the carbon portfolio within the forest inventory and analysis program.
Great, thanks, Grant. Today, we're discussing the research article, Insect and Disease Disturbances Correlate with Reduced Carbon Sequestration in Forests of the Contiguous United States, published in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change last month. The senior author is Brendan Quirin, who's with Cornell University. Grant and Leigh are co-authors who were instrumental in the execution of this research. This paper, which I found fascinating and shared with my staff immediately upon release, indicates that forests impacted by insects sequester about 69% less carbon than unaffected forests, and those impacted by diseases sequester about 28% less carbon. We will make a link to the paper available to our readers. Before we delve too deep in this topic, could one of you simply define carbon sequestration and explain how it differs from another commonly used term in your paper and elsewhere, carbon storage?
Sure, Chris, that is a good question. So when I describe carbon sequestration and storage, I often use sort of the analogy of a bank account. So carbon storage might be your bank account, the money that you've got in the account. Sequestration is removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and that might be considered sort of a deposit into that bank account. You also have loss of carbon, in this case, due to insects, disease, fire, harvesting, other things, or transfer of carbon, and that might be considered sort of a withdrawal from the account.
Great, thanks, Grant. Leigh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that's an excellent way of phrasing it, and I think it's important to understand that all forests are undergoing some deposits and some withdrawals under natural states. So what we're going to be talking about in our paper are situations where those withdrawals and those deposits get way too big or way too small.
Sure, thanks, Leigh. So to put your work into perspective, it's my understanding that U.S. forests offset, that is, they sequester about 14% of our annual emissions. Is that accurate, and has that changed much in recent years?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. So that 14% is really the equivalent offset of total economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions, and that includes not only the sequestration from forests, but also the transfer of carbon from forest to harvested wood products, as well as sequestration in urban trees and settlements. So really all the treed resources in the United States offset about 14% of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. And over time, since 1990, that's really the period that we've been tracking this. Actually, the sink strength in the United States, so that 14% has actually declined slightly. So emissions since about 2005, economy-wide emissions have decreased, while the forest contribution have remained relatively stable.
Great, thanks, Grant. So in short, as you kind of indicated earlier to our readers, forests sequester carbon, they store carbon, and they also emit or release carbon. We talked a little bit about carbon sequestration already. How much carbon do U.S. forests store relative to our emissions? And again, has this changed very much in recent years?
Yeah, another good question. So forests are a massive sink. So they store a tremendous amount of carbon. More than 30 years of CO2 emissions from automobiles alone are stored in our forests in the US. It's over 50 million metric tons. And so the carbon stocks in US forests are orders of magnitude larger than the annual increase or decrease in that change. So the deposits and withdrawals are relatively small compared to the large stock of carbon. The majority of that carbon is actually stored in the soil. So more than 50% of carbon in forests is in soils. As you move north, that distribution of carbon actually increases. Even more of that is stored in soils, less is in the above ground components. How that's changed, so typically the carbon stocks in the US have increased over that same period that I described earlier, from 1990 to present, because on an annual basis, we've got a lot of growth, more growth than we are removing in many cases. In total, the carbon stocks are increasing. But if you zoom in from sort of the entirety of the United States, there are certainly regions that are losing more carbon than they're gaining for a whole variety of reasons, including insects and disease, wildfires, harvesting, etc.
Grant, what regions or cover types tend to store the most carbon?
Yeah, well, it's those young active forests that are really the carbon pump in the United States. So forests in the southern United States are generally the largest contributor to our sink strength. Meanwhile, those slower growing forests or areas affected by disturbances, particularly abrupt disturbances where a lot of that carbon can return to the atmosphere quickly, those areas tend to store less carbon. So parts of the Intermountain West have been seriously affected by really, compound disturbances, insects, disease, wildfire, extreme drought, etc., have really contributed to a decline in the sink strength over the last few decades.
Great, thanks, Grant. Leigh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that was great. I'm glad we've got Grant on.
Yeah, he's the expert in terms of what's going on there in the carbon world and forest systems. As you folks discussed in your paper, forest insects and diseases damage and kill large numbers of trees, and they can do that in relatively short periods of time, reducing a forest's capacity to sequester carbon in some cases. And as Grant already suggested, now they also interact with other disturbances such as wildfire, which is of particular importance here in the West. We've talked a little bit now about carbon sequestration, a little bit about carbon storage, but what about carbon emissions from forests? It's easy, for example, to see how wildfires may release large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, but how are carbon emissions affected by large numbers of dead and dying trees due to insects and disease outbreaks?
Yeah, that's another great question, Chris. And part of it is we need to think about this sort of system boundary, not just spatially in terms of extent, but also temporally. The time that it takes for carbon from the point that it's sequestered in live vegetation to the point that it actually returns to the atmosphere. As you mentioned, in some cases, following wildfire, some of that biomass, live or dead, may be consumed in that fire and returned abruptly to the atmosphere. A lot of the carbon, though, is actually transferred from that live tree pool into dead trees or into litter or soil. And that can end up persisting in that ecosystem for a long time. So typically when we're talking to the carbon community, we don't refer to things as emissions or removals, but more often transfers. We've got transfers of carbon from the atmosphere into live vegetation. And as a result of insects or disease where we've got mortality happening, we've got a transfer of carbon from the live trees into the standing dead tree pool or into down dead wood. And so what that does is it might accelerate to some extent the rate by which that carbon returns to the atmosphere because those trees are dying, but it doesn't mean that it's abruptly lost like it would be from wildfire, for example. It takes time through decomposition for that carbon to return to the atmosphere. And so how long that takes is really dependent on the ecosystem. What we have found is that cool and wet environments tend to retain that carbon more so than warm and wet environments. And so that has to do with sort of the microbial activity, decomposition rates, and other disturbances that might come in following insects and diseases. As you noted, these compound events where you may have a drought followed by insects, followed by fire. The type of fuel that exists in those forests is somewhat, a reflection of the distribution of carbon across that ecosystem from live trees, dead trees, litter, as well as soil.
So if some of those dead trees were actually salvaged and put into solid wood products, that would be another way of retaining that carbon and reducing its emission back into the environment. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
absolutely. There are ways to maintain the carbon storage even though sequestration has stopped. So sequestration means that the tree basically continues to grow, whereas storage means that the wood itself is not decomposing or burning and turning into atmospheric carbon again. And so when you do have a sustainable harvesting plan and you're taking down the right types of trees for like a good type of thinning project or harvest project, you can actually retain a lot of the stored carbon in the form of mass timber, solid wood packaging, all sorts of solid wood products. All those things can actually be used to slow the cycle that Grant was talking about. With invasive insects and diseases as well as native insects and diseases, it's not an either or of alive or dead. A lot of these insects just slow the growth of trees, and because they stress them very badly. They don't necessarily even kill them. And slowing the growth of the trees reduces the amount of carbon pulled into the structure of the tree. So you simply, your tree might survive, but on the landscape as a whole, you're pulling less carbon out of the air as a result of these disturbances than ordinarily would have been sequestered, even on the same landscape.
Yeah, just to build on what Leigh said there, Chris, that's really the crux of this analysis. So there have been other papers that have looked at changes or losses of carbon as a result of abrupt disturbances, even these more chronic events. But I think the sort of novel part of this paper was this term that we use throughout the paper, capacity. So the capacity of these forests to sequester carbon was reduced because of what Leigh described, sort of the stress that insects and disease lead to in into the live vegetation, reduces their capacity to grow or sequester carbon from the atmosphere. The other, I think, important point is this idea of accumulation, that we can have carbon in forests accumulate over time. And that's generally what we've seen over the last 3 decades, is that carbon is accumulating thanks to sequestration or removal of carbon from the atmosphere, and is accumulating in all sorts of pools, not just the live tree pool. And then in terms of losses and slowing those losses, we sort of describe this as sort of avoided emissions. How do we avoid emissions through management and mitigation? And there are lots of ways to avoid those emissions through harvesting, salvage logging, where we can trap that carbon in long-lived wood products or substitute that material for some more fossil fuel intensive product.
Great, thanks. And I do want to spend a little bit more time on management implications towards the end of our discussion here this morning. In reviewing your methods, your data analyses come from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which among others has responsibilities for forest carbon reporting and analyses. Grant, since you work could you describe the FIA program to our readers?
Yeah, sure, Chris. So the FIA program has been around since the late 1920s, early 1930s. It started as a timber inventory focused on really the productive forest land in the U.S. and has grown into a comprehensive forest inventory program that now really tracks all sorts of things beyond just trees growing, but really the status and trends of forests across 15 time zones. So it's not just the conterminous United States that was the focus of this paper, but also US territories, Hawaii, Alaska are also included and measured on a regular basis as part of the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. So this inventory is really a network of permanent sample plots that are measured across all ownerships. So there are sample plots on forest land, non-forest land. Because it's the forest inventory, there's a pretty specific definition that we use to identify plots that meet that definition of forest land. And it's those plots that the Forest Service sends field crews out to visit at a regular basis every 5 to 10 years and collect the information necessary to then make inferences or estimates of carbon stocks and changes over time.
Thanks, Grant. This is kind of a follow-up question specific to FIA and was actually submitted by one of our members. FIA measurement data, as the paper clearly indicates, were lacking for the Rocky Mountains, which limited some of your analyses. Why was that the case?
Yeah, so part of it's timing, Chris. So in a lot of cases, we do have remeasurements in the Intermountain West. Part of it is just the modeling, the way that the what we call components of change are calculated, which is sort of a novel way of doing sort of net accounting for all the loss of trees, removal of trees, and then being able to attribute those to particular activities on the landscape. In the Intermountain West, there just wasn't enough remeasurements to actually compile those components of change in the same way that we could in the Pacific Coast and the Eastern United States. So a little more detail. East of the Mississippi River, plots are measured every 5 to 7 years. And west of the Mississippi, plots are measured approximately every 10 years. So a remeasurement cycle is, 10 years long, and it would take 20 years to measure all of those plots. So a little more detail. The FIA program moved from a periodic inventory where a state was measured in totality in a year or two. And now we have this annual inventory where a fraction of the plots are measured every year. So in a state like Colorado, because it's on a 10-year inventory cycle, about 10% of the plots are distributed randomly across the state each year, and those plots are visited and measured in each year. So that each year, that 10% is representative of the forest area. So we can make an estimate of the forest area and other attributes like carbon with only 10% of the plots, the way that they're distributed across the state. But each year we're collecting another 10%. So after 10 years, 100% of the forested plots in a state are measured. And so while the estimate might not change in terms of forest area or carbon from one year to the next, the uncertainty in our estimates decrease as we take additional measurements and additional plots each year.
So
Grant,
to answer,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Leigh.
Oh, thank you. So to answer the question at its absolutely most basic, in order to create a rate of sequestration, you have to have a starting point and a stopping point. And across most of our the area that we used for this analysis, we had both starting points and stopping points. But unfortunately, due to the time period we were using, the Rocky Mountain states had starting points, but not stopping points. So rates, change over time could not be specifically calculated for those states. It's not that we didn't include them in the analysis. It's that they didn't have regionally specific rates because we couldn't get those 2 time points into the analysis that the way that we wanted to. In theory, several people have asked me this. In theory, could we do this again in the future and incorporate enough data to do the Rocky Mountains as well? The answer is absolutely. It's simply a matter of the snapshots in time that we chose to use and what was available to us for this analysis. So we could do it again, in theory, in order to bring the Rocky Mountains in with specific rates for those regions.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Thanks for that clarification, Leigh.
Yeah.
Let me just kind of continue along that line of thought because it really does focus on the Rocky Mountains. And in terms of reviewing your methods, it seems to me that your results are quite conservative. That is that they likely underestimate the true impacts of insects and diseases on carbon sequestration. And I really say that for 2 primary reasons. And one of them we've kind of hit on already, that low level but often chronic disturbances are very important, but they're ignored in your data set. And perhaps more importantly, the data from the Rocky Mountain states were lacking where insects, specifically bark beetles, have exerted very large impacts in recent years. And just to put that into perspective, for example, we have some ongoing work in the Intermountain West where we've been studying the long-term effects of the mountain pine beetle outbreak on lodgepole pine forests. And in that system, over 40% of the trees were killed during the outbreak. And in some areas, we experienced greater than 20% tree mortality in a single year. So I'm wondering, do you view your results, which I'll repeat for our readers, that forests impact impacted by insects sequester about 69% less carbon, and those impacted by diseases sequester about 28% less carbon. Do you view those results as being somewhat conservative?
Yes, absolutely. That was really the point. And we as an author team went back and forth on this in terms of how best to handle that region. You know, from a greenhouse gas reporting perspective, we can see this, that there's been large transfers of carbon from live trees to dead trees in the Intermountain West using similar methods. And so, you know, I would say that if we were to do this again, those estimates would absolutely be conservative. Leigh?
Absolutely. It's a conservative estimate for several reasons. One is that we had to make decisions about how we did the analysis on a really big scope. And as a result of that, we were only able to use plots with severe insect and disease disturbances. So if the disturbance wasn't ranked as the highest level, we were not able to use it as as part of the analysis. So background levels of insects and diseases and in those affected plots were not part of the sort of comparison. So in that very selection of which data to use, we were cherry picking out some of the more mild disturbances, which certainly add up across the contiguous United States.
Yeah,
And
to sort of build, go ahead, Leigh.
Go ahead. No, you're fine.
I'll just build on that a little bit. So what she's referring to is sort of the way that we classify evidence of disturbance within the FIA program. And so in this particular case, we used condition classifications, which say basically 25% of the trees on the plot have some evidence of insect or disease damage, and those were classified as the most important disturbance. So there are other ways using individual tree data that you could actually do a more resolved analysis. So Leigh's absolutely right that that's just another example of how and why this analysis is conservative, just in terms of that minimum threshold for the plots to be identified as having evidence of insect or disease damage and or mortality.
Which is really important, you know, when we're discussing kind of the implications of this work to others.
Yeah, and just one other thing to add too, we know that there's been an extremely large amount of insect damage north of the west coast of the United States, up into British Columbia, Alberta, et cetera. I mean, they've had absolutely historic levels of bark beetle damage and tree death in that region. But because we use the FIA data, which is restricted to the United States Forestry Program, we were not able to incorporate Canadian forests into this analysis. When you look at this from the perspective of my program, where I'm trying to really incorporate a continental-wide approach, it is a problem of how conservative the data probably ends up being that we were not able to incorporate British Columbia, for instance. So when you look at the biggest picture, we know this is a very conservative estimate, but in being so conservative with the data, we have some power to say that at a minimum, this problem is very serious. At a maximum, it's even more serious.
Great, thanks, Leigh. So Leigh, you talked a little bit earlier, you just kind of started a discussion on management implications of this work. And then I also heard one of you use the term mitigation. So perhaps could you start by defining mitigation and then talk a little bit more about the management implications? That would be of particular interest to our readers.
Sure. So as I mentioned at the start of our talk, there are so many natural up and down cycles in forests with insects and disease. They are a part of the ecosystem. They are important and necessary. And so one of the really important things to realize about this paper is that we're not saying that you have to eliminate natural insect and disease cycles from your landscape, but you can mitigate the ups and downs, the big pulses of tree death or damage and of resulting big pulses of carbon in and out of the cycle are really what we're trying to focus on. So, you know, science based management strategies to, for instance, you know, put in place thinning regimes that are going to maximize tree health, or otherwise just looking at the newer management strategies that focus on things like prescribed burns in appropriate areas, things like diversifying plantings if you're in a managed landscape. It's not a set of recommendations you haven't heard before. It's really just that management activities can soften the blow of native insects before they create these big up and down cycles that we've seen now in our data really release a lot of carbon. But then as well as that, the biggest part of the work that I do is on non-native insects and diseases, and actions that you take to prevent non-native insects and diseases from reaching the area that you're in, as well as from reaching North America in general, have a huge bang for the buck, because those insects and diseases don't operate the same way. Generally speaking, they create more significant damage. They kill trees once they're invasive species at much higher rates, and they're much more difficult to manage because they don't have a natural up and down cycle in the ecology of the forest where they're attacking. That's the nature of the beast for invasive species. So it's a complex question because you have both native species that you want to, incorporate into your management plan for sort of healthy, normal ecosystem function long-term with your with both the actions you take and the actions you decide not to take, as well as you have these non-native insects and diseases that require an entirely different strategy to mitigate damage.
Thanks. Grant, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that, this is sort of a line of work. Our team has been working a lot in this sort of nature-based solutions space in recent years. And I think this is another paper that sort of highlights potential or lack of potential in some cases, that we need to be realistic about what the potential is, particularly for native insects, as Leigh mentioned, that some of these insects are endemic, and these cycles that we experience are sort of real. And so having and being able to put a number, an estimate on the contributions of insects and diseases and how they may impact sequestration capacity helps us be more realistic about what the potential is moving forward, and helps to inform the types of mitigation adaptation activities that we pursue in a realistic manner, to not overestimate the potential, because we know that these pests and pathogens, especially those that are native, are likely to persist, regardless of what we do. It's how do we manage in the face of these, and also a changing climate, to sort of maximize the potential, while also realizing that we can't get rid of them.
Right. And different insects and diseases have different levels of realistic management. Some of them have these massive up and down cycles, and that needs to be part of your long-term plan. And perhaps in that sort of environment, you're going to have trouble maintaining a lot of carbon storage on the landscape, because you'll have big swings in sequestration. But that doesn't mean that you should strive to eliminate native insects and diseases by any means. That is not an outcome of this paper. What it is that you should understand, like Grant was saying, the potential of your landscape to do the best it can under the natural circumstances that it has existed in for millennia. And if past land use decisions or land management decisions, whether they be harvest-based, thinning, salvage logging, prescribed burn, if we now look back on those decisions and see that they weren't in line with modern thinking, you have an opportunity to change in the future and improve your management and reach multiple goals, both carbon and other management goals, with looking forward into the future with this in mind.
Sure. Go ahead, Grant.
That's a great point, Leigh. And I would just say that, we worked hard in this analysis to try and factor out and eliminate sort of confounding factors to the extent that we could. But Leigh brings up a really good point, in the sense that, this is a snapshot in time that is really a product of, decades, really centuries of carbon accumulation, growth, previous land use and management. And so, this snapshot just reflects contemporary conditions, but it's really an artifact of, or a reflection of, hundreds of years of human activities, natural disturbances, etc. And so, continuing to do these types of analyses over long time periods will also help inform how we mitigate and adapt.
Absolutely.
Grant, you mentioned climate change, and I thought I would just mention to the reader that there is quite a bit of evidence now, and increasingly so, that climate change is exacerbating some of the impacts of forest insects and diseases in some of our systems here in the US. In closing, your article indicates that the reduction in carbon sequestration capacity associated with forest insects and diseases is equivalent to the annual emissions of over 10 million passenger vehicles. I personally was very impressed with this figure until I went and looked and found out that there are 275 million vehicles registered in the United States. This brings me back to the first sentence of your introduction. Both reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and increases in carbon sequestration and storage by natural systems are necessary to address climate change. Any final comments in that regard?
I think that it's a really, really good point that no paper is an island. We're looking at this because it has merit unto itself, but it is part of a much bigger picture when we talk about climate change, when we talk about forests, when we talk about the entire globe. It's critically important to take multiple actions right now, and this is one of them. So better understanding non-native insects and diseases and how you can prevent their entry into North America, as well as native insects and diseases and how you can mitigate the damage they do, bring them to a more healthy level than they are today, is very, very important. But it's by no means the only thing that we should be doing as a society for both forest management and to address climate change.
Grant?
Yeah, I would just build on what Leigh said, that this is really part of a portfolio approach that includes humanity. You know, we need to make changes and we need to think about all sorts of nature-based solutions. This is just reflecting sort of one aspect of that. What is the capacity of forests? And in this case, you know, there's a reduction in the capacity of forests because of native and non-native insects and diseases. And so I think this helps sort of you know, narrow the air bounds on our estimates of what's possible, you know, and also point to the contribution. So as you mentioned, that's 10 million cars that would otherwise be off the road, or at least the emissions would be offset. And so this combined with many other activities, I think is really the way that we need to be thinking about this is really a portfolio approach to the land, but also you know, carbon removal beyond the land.
There is also an important aspect here in tree planting. So there are so many conversations right now about the importance of planting trees and creating forested systems that can sequester carbon. And right here in our paper, we're showing that you have to also manage those forested systems in order to reach that benefit. You can't just plant a bunch of trees. As everybody who listens to this video and article knows, that's not how it works. You have to plant the right types of trees for the area. You have to create appropriate diversity for your region, and then you have to manage for your desired outcome. And part of managing for your desired outcomes is going to be managing insect and disease threats on a very broad scale to ensure that you actually get where you're trying to go. And I really appreciate the idea of sort of like, is this a drop in the bucket? I mean, it is. If you're being a pessimist, yes, it's a small piece of the puzzle. However, if you extend it to the entire continental United States and you think to yourself, what if we utterly failed to manage the addition of new pests and pathogens, things like emerald ash borer that stand to functionally eliminate an entire genus of North American trees if left unchecked? If we failed at that for years and years to come, this impact would grow, it would multiply, and we would not reach any of our tree planting goals because those trees would never reach maturity in the first place.
Leigh, Grant, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chris.